So we're going to talk a little bit about poorly designed systems. First, has anybody else walked into the men's bathroom? I did it this morning. Because on the first floor, the women's bathroom is on the right. So up here, before I got mic'd up, they said, "Do you need to use the bathroom?" I said, "Sure." And I went and walked right in and turned around, and there was urinals. Thank goodness there were no other men in the bathroom. Again, we talk about poorly designed. I just assumed it was on the right like it was on the first floor. So as we start the morning, as you can see here, seen, to be heard. How does that happen? And then the patient will see you now. What does that look like? I hope that we can answer some of those questions for you as we conclude this morning's session by sharing about our journey, which was by no means conventional and definitely had its challenges. First, I'm a full spectrum practicing family medicine clinician, and I love seeing patients and delivering babies. In fact, I delivered 2 yesterday, and I'm praying that babies stay in while I finish this talk, as I've got about 8 due over the next 2 weeks. So that's a full-time job in itself. Yet every day, I ask myself and feel that we could be doing more for patients, our communities, and each other as a staff caring for patients. Our story begins with 2 communities, Albert Lea and Austin, located right here in Minnesota. The people that live in these communities, along with the clinicians and staff that care for them. Now, I'm not the CEO or the administrator in these clinics. Like I said, I'm the full spectrum practicing family medicine clinician who is challenged every day with being asked to do more with less. And I struggle because I'm unsure how I can meet the demands of my clinic that's driven by metrics that value something that is very different than what patients in the community value. The stories we'll share with you today will resonate with many of you because they're not unique just to our clinic. They are speaking to a bigger challenge that we're trying to address, and it's that we're experiencing a crisis of care. We've respectfully called this work the patient voice work, and it's a journey that began over 18 months ago. And it started, as most challenges do in healthcare, we have a problem to solve. In this case, it was poor utilization of the emergency department. And this problem was perceived and understood really just from one side. But when you think of poor utilization, what does that really mean? It's a label that's made in hindsight from the final diagnosis with no appreciation for the person or the context. For patients, overutilization of the emergency department was not a problem. In fact, the ED was a welcoming place. It was an open door. When they had a clinical need, they could go there any time of day, any day of the week, and get their clinical need addressed. For patients, it wasn't about the utilization of services, and a lot of times it wasn't about time or about cost. It was about being seen and heard. So this work has evolved into an effort to return care, which is a feeling that is not easily measured, into our delivery models within healthcare. The following stories will illustrate a little bit about what's been deemed as poor utilization. This is Charlie. He's an 87-year-old gentleman who has lived in his same community his entire life. He develops difficulty breathing, and he calls his local clinic, who knows him, knows that he has a condition called COPD, and when he's presented like in the past, they know exactly what treatment they need to give him to make him feel better. Now, recently his clinic is closed. So this time when he develops the difficulty breathing, he has to call the new clinic that he was directed to for care, and they tell him, "You need to go to the ED." And he goes because he's not sure if something else is going on. When he gets to the ED, he discovers that it is his COPD that's having an exacerbation, and that he could have managed it the same way he had in the past, at home with the help of his primary care team. It's a failure because he didn't know his diagnosis before going in, and a failure because he didn't have a relationship with another part of the system. Here's Arthur. He's a 3-month-old. He's got high fevers and a rash. The parents call the triage line and they say, you need an appointment. There's not one available in primary care for 2 days, and they're leaving town the next day. So they go to the ED, and in the ED they're told he has a cold and a viral rash. Ultimately, this is again a failure because they utilized other services or other open doors because the one recommended, in this case primary care, was not available. For these patients, these health concerns were real. They represented a potential emergency. And with each of these stories, the context, the individual patient situation, along with what they had available for care, informed why they ended up in the ED. When you consider these stories and these contexts, it tells you something very different about the problem that we're trying to solve, which leads to this key takeaway. When we limit our understanding of the problem, we limit our possibilities for the solution. What we found is that the problems were most often framed as a business problem, and that's what happens with the poor utilization framing. It leads to very predictable and not very successful outcomes. The problem in each of these stories, they weren't business problems. They were human, emotional problems where patients wanted a caring and human response, not a business response. When patients reach out to us for care, they are seeking a clinical and emotional need, yet our response to those needs are often strict rules, inflexible, and solely business solutions. So as you think about this, it really becomes not about poor utilization, it's not about accessing, and it tells us that our traditional solutions are not the right ones. What we heard often was the solution of better education. And I bet many have heard this in the crowd. We heard, if we only educated patients better and told them about how to utilize the ED, then the system would work beautifully. But poorly designed systems, even with all the education in the world, still won't work the way we expect. And what we found for patients was when we asked them what the ED was intended for, not surprisingly, they could tell us exactly what it was intended for. They'd say, if I have a heart attack, if I have a stroke, or if I have a broken bone. And then we said, so when was the last time that you used the emergency department? It was a few weeks ago, it was a few months ago, because of another roadblock that they had encountered from the system. They couldn't get into the specialist, their follow-up appointment had been scheduled out for several weeks, or they still had symptoms that they had no idea what the diagnosis was and what to do while they waited until they could get an appointment. When you think about that for patients, this, again, as I said, is not a question of poor utilization, and it was not a question about this next solution that we were given, which was access. They said, if you just gave patients more access, then you'll have your answer. Sorry for that. And with the rigid productivity schedules, what we found was it amounted to asking staff to just work harder and faster. They had less time, they had more burnout, and it was a clear priority that was focused on throughput, not on them developing a relationship with their patients or understanding what that patient needed. And so I have an example for all of you. We did an interesting experiment a few years ago with patients around access. We were trying to understand what it meant to engage them in care and what access would look like. So a colleague and I gave patients 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week access to us, okay? You can imagine what we heard from the clinic. There was fear, there was skepticism, there were roadblocks. They said, you can't do that. Patients will message you all the time, it'll be all hours of the night, and if you offer it to patients, then everybody will want it. Interestingly, what we actually experienced, patients messaged at reasonable times. It was early morning before work, before the clinic had opened, or in the early evening when the clinic had closed already for routine care. We also found that only a handful of the concerns that were addressed really required the expertise or training of a clinician. The majority were about how to navigate a system that for patients often lacks transparency and seems like a fortress that they have no idea how to enter. So you can see that with all of these kind of insights and these takeaways, that for patients, again, it was not about utilization of services, it was not about access. What we were really trying to address was a crisis. a crisis of care. With the rigid rules, the repeated, "I'm sorry, I can't help you," it occurs between patients and staffs and leaves them frustrated. And I can tell you, I experience this every day. And it starts to kill your spirit a little bit, especially since I see my role in healthcare as a vocation and not just a job, which led to the primary insight for our work. If it goes, there we go. A patient's sense of care comes primarily from how much they believe the clinic's response is informed by their particular situation. They want to know that we know them. And when patients don't feel cared for, they tend to do one of two things. They will escalate their demands for care, or they will pull away from the clinic completely. And they're both very reasonable responses when you think about how the system's been designed. Think about the clinic's attempts at telling their patients about colon cancer screening. It might be automated orders that are made by their electronic medical record, or a panel manager that is sending the patient messages or calling them. When patients don't feel cared for in the current process or in the past, they're very likely to forego this call for screening, which led to this aim for the work. Support patient and clinic staff in developing a healing and longitudinal relationship. In order to do so, care and feeling cared for are crucial. It contributes to patient and staff satisfaction, care plan follow-through, and the likelihood that they would recommend us to care for their loved ones. To achieve a sense of care, frontline staff need the ability to appreciate and respond to the patient and their situation. And that's what we're trying to do with this work. We're trying to take our aim into developing principles, which I'll share with all of you, that the aim is our vision, the principles are our mission, and we're allowing that to guide the experimentation and exploration that we are doing with solutions by working with the patients, the communities, and the clinic staff. Our first principle, support critical thinking for all care team staff. A patient calls in with UTI symptoms. The rigid nursing protocol, it misses when the patient shares that they have a complex medical history. An appointment's recommended, and there's not one available in primary care, so the patient has to go to express care. But express care can't see that patient because of that complex medical history. So now they have to go back to primary care to try to get an appointment. The algorithm-directed care, it was not responsive to the patient or their situation. Now, when critical thinking is supported, the nurse captures this additional information, is able to talk to that patient's care team that knows them well, is able to get urine studies ordered, and to start treatment and direct a follow-up plan if things don't get better. In this situation, both nursing and the patient knew what was needed, and what they needed was a system that supported critical thinking. Our next principle, patient context, biography and biology, something I know we all try to do on a day-to-day basis. I know I do. When you think about a typical day, 20 plus patients to see. If you're a medical assistant, rooming patients, even more than that to room. And as a nurse, you've got endless triage messages, portal messages, and trying to call patients. Can we really do this in our day-to-day interactions with patients? It's unlikely because the system's not designed to cultivate it. Here's an example where it's not cultivated. So this patient, it's in our depression kind of screening and remission process. So the patient comes in for knee pain, and when the patient is seen, the patient is asked during the rooming process to complete a depression screener. Now they wonder, why am I being asked this? I had knee pain. We all know why they're being asked, because there's a quality metric that when you fill out a depression screener, that equals quality depression care. So the patient fills it out and fills the bubbles, and they get a score of 7. Now, a year ago, their score was a 1. The system only targets their depression if they have a score of 10 or greater, or if they have suicidal thoughts, which this patient does not. So the result is the screener is charted as completed, the patient has a visit about their knee pain, and the visit ends. And they leave wondering, why did they ask me about my depression in the first place? Do they care that I might be feeling depressed? And what do I do if my symptoms don't get better? Alternatively, if the clinic were to ask the patient in their own words, what brings you greatest joy? Or what's your greatest health concern today? And the patient shared, I really enjoy running. And it helps manage my stress and my mood. when my knee pain started, I couldn't be active. And so now my mood's gotten worse, and I'm worried that I might be getting depressed. If that information is shared with the clinician ahead of time in a summary before the visit, they have context and they have insight. They have ability to respond to the patient, and that's a metric that matters. Our third principle, creating flexibility and responsiveness in the care systems. The idea of flexibility created a lot of angst. We've been so rigid that frontline staff don't know what it means when we say be flexible, and they're afraid they're going to get in trouble by their leadership. And we saw this in this example. This is Dan, single father, 2 young children, and he's told his youngest is behind on immunizations. He works 2 jobs to make ends meet, and he only has Saturdays off. So he asks if he can go to Saturday morning clinic, and he's told, no, we don't do routine immunizations in Saturday morning clinic. You might ask why? Because Saturday morning clinic is only for acute care, and we can't do routine immunizations. Not that we can't physically do routine immunizations. That response that desk and nursing staff had to tell that patient was frustrating. It was not responsive. And what it told that patient is we do not value a relationship with you, and we do not value you as a person. What they needed was a system that supported them to be responsive to that patient and to provide care. Our last principle, and arguably one of the most important, especially in our rural and underserved populations, which I know Dr. Wood shared earlier, is this community engagement and how to address challenges. What we've done here, again, recognizing there are staff shortages, okay? And there's a need for a lean workforce. So the reality for these communities where their clinician lived in their community and taken care of them for the last 30 years is no longer a reality. And you then add in technology and the automation of many services, and relationships have been lost. So what we've chosen to do is to work with the communities around designing solutions. We've done workshops, one's called Hello and Goodbye. And what we're doing with them is saying, okay, we recognize that this may be your new reality. New staff will come in and new staff will be leaving. How do we make this more manageable for you as a community and build some resiliency? We've also worked on how to help retain staff in the community by building relationships with them and allowing them to come up to speed on what the needs are of the community. The other opportunity is to look at care delivery models that might be different for these communities. It could be being seen in the local school or the public health department. The key is that when we work together, the sky's the limit. Arriving at these principles came through an investment of time in people and hearing their voices, along with working with and within the current constraints of the system and resources. We chose to design with, not for. And we were challenged by the same thing many of you are challenged with every day. There was skepticism, there's burnout from yet another thing that people are asked to do, and the needs for outcomes and results yesterday. So at times, if I'm honest, I truly wondered if we would be able to accomplish this work based on all the roadblocks and challenges we were faced with as we tried to make a shift in processes and culture. So how do we overcome it? We chose to persist, to demand metrics that matter, and to be bold. I'm fortunate to stand up here today and share all this work with all of you, and I apologize I went over. But I'd like to thank, again, quickly here, my talented partner in this work, Maggie Breslin, who's the co-director for the Patient Revolution. And most importantly, I'd like to thank the patients, Albert Lee and Austin community that was patient and kind with us, and then especially our leadership within the institution that has supported this work. So as you leave Transform, we'd ask you to think about the following. How can the principles of critical thinking, flexible and responsive systems, patient context, and community engagement lead to a revolution in healthcare? And how can you be part of it? Thank you.